All right, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. It's Hugh here from Procountancy. I want to say a big thank you for turning up for this live stream. You can see here I'm getting everything set up. I'm really excited about this one. As you can see here, this is the November 25, February 26 SCS Pre-Scene Insights, and I think you're going to really enjoy this session. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait a few more seconds for a few more people to join. We have great attendance already, which is fantastic to see, but I'm conscious that sometimes people like to join a little bit later. Now, something that I would really appreciate is if one of you or whoever can just comment and let me know that you can hear me okay. Okay, so one time I was doing one of these live streams and actually had the microphone turned off and no one could hear me, and I was sitting there talking to myself for like an hour, okay? So if someone can let me know if you can hear me fine, you can hear me clearly, we'll get going. And just to be aware, just so you're aware, there's a storm going on in my country at the moment, and you can maybe hear wind or you can hear some rain in the background. Don't worry too much about it. There's not much that I can do about it, unfortunately. We're trying our hardest here. I'm using AI in order to kind of block out some of the background noises. So maybe at times my voice might sound a little bit robotic when the wind gets really strong, but it's not going to stop us. This is something that I have been really looking forward to, and I'm sure you have been too. Okay, so I can see a few people here, lots of familiar names. It's really cool to see you all, and thank you so much for joining me. Wow, it's an amazing attendance. So big thanks everyone for turning up. Okay, so let's get stuck into this, right? So this is the pre-scene insights. Now, just so you're aware, I take a slightly different approach to the pre-scene than many other tuition providers. I don't believe it's that valuable if I go through page by page by page by page and say, look at this, look at this, look at this, right? You're well able to read through the pre-scene yourself, okay? So I highly recommend you go through the pre-scene. This is not a substitute for going through the pre-scene. Where I add value is I can tell you what's important, what could be a part of a scenario perhaps, or what could be tested in terms of the syllabus, okay, in relation to this specific piece of the pre-scene. And that's what's valuable to you. That's why you're here, okay? Everything else you can kind of go through yourself. Okay, so in this live stream, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the key coverage first. So we're going to look at different blocks of the pre-scene that I think are important. We are going to go through the whole thing, okay, but we're going to summarize it, okay? So we won't be going through every single detail. That's just important to be aware of, because I'm conscious that, you know, someone might look at this and not actually go through the pre-scene themselves, okay? It is important to read through it. The next thing is callouts, and these are key callouts. These are things that I think you should be aware of. They may not be directly referenced within the pre-scene, but they are things that I think maybe could form a scenario, maybe could be tested, or maybe just things that are important to be aware of in general, okay? So there are some themes that we come across in these pre-scene documents that are kind of the same no matter what, okay? So first things first, right? Pages 1 and 2. This is nice and easy, okay? So the first page is always the same. We have a logo. Usually it's a really ugly logo. In this case, it's slightly better, okay? And in this instance, the business is called Cumulator, okay? So a bit of a weird name. And on the second page, we have a table of contents. We can ignore that. It's a short document. You don't really need this table of contents. And then underneath that, you have a really useful summary, okay? And this summary states that the business is called Cumulator and they manufacture electric cars, okay? So, you know, I put the feelers out and I asked people, what do they think about this pre-scene? I think there was a sigh of relief, because the last one was about satellites. This one is about electric cars, okay? So something we're a bit more familiar with. And actually, I'm just back from China last month. I was in Shenzhen, where every single car I saw was an electric car. So if you're watching from China, or maybe you're watching from another country that has a ton of electric cars, you'll be really familiar with this, okay? So you're a senior manager for Cumulator. You always see this within the SCS pre-scene documents. You're senior manager. What does that mean? A senior manager could mean anything, really. What does it mean in this context? Well, a senior manager is someone who is at the layer just below the board, okay? So you're there to advise the board. Typically, you're advising the CFO or the finance director on various different issues, okay? So risk management, corporate governance, finance strategy, and so on. Now, the company is based in this fictional country, Duxland, okay? So, again, another very creative name here from CIMA, Duxland, okay? We're going to become really familiar with this as we go through the pre-scene and as we go through the process of studying for this exam. It notes that it's a developed country. Now, why is that important? Why have they written that? They haven't just put that in there for the fun of it. Basically, what this means for us in terms of assumptions is that we can assume that if it's a developed country, that there is a stable government. Okay, so political risk is a part of the syllabus, core activity B. We can assume to a certain extent that interest rates are somewhat stable. Okay, and same with currency rates. Okay, and all of those are testable within core activity B. Okay, the next, it's got a well-regulated stock exchange. So why would that be included? Again, we can assume from this that there is at least a semi-strong level of market efficiency within Duxland. That means that if there's new information released into the market about accumulator, and that information relates to the destruction or creation of shareholder value, well, that could have an impact on our share price. Okay? It uses the D dollar. So currency risk is within the scope of the syllabus. So you'll have to get familiar with the D dollar, and even something as simple as, using the name Duxland, using the D dollar in your answers. That's a form of application, okay? So small things can go a long way in terms of applying your answer to the scenario. So pages 3 and 4 are just giving you some background information about the industry, and this is something that we always have within the preceding documents, and the reason why is because CIMA want to ensure that everyone is on the same level in terms of the industry. Now, some of you may actually work in a motor manufacturer, maybe you actually work in a specific EV company, maybe a battery company, something like that. You may have some additional expertise in this industry, but these industry pages just make sure that everyone is at least on somewhat the same page, okay? So it notes within the pre-scene, and this is kind of a delineation that we see throughout, that there's two different types of vehicles, okay, in this context. There's an ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine, so they use fuel, so petrol or diesel, and then we have an EV, electric vehicle. Now, something to note here is that the term EV is used and an electric car is used. Now, in this particular case, the company just produces cars, okay? So EV is more of a broader term. It could be like an electric van or something like that, a car, a truck. But in this case, car, vehicle, doesn't really matter which one you use because the company just produces electric cars at the moment. Of course, we could have an exam scenario where that changes. So it notes that there's 4 different types of EVs, and you'll see these being referenced throughout the pre-scene, and as well you see these being used, these abbreviations, in the real world as well. So battery electric, that's your kind of standard electric car. You would think about like a Tesla that just runs on electricity, okay? We have a plug-in hybrid, a PHEV, and just to note, battery electric, they're normally written as BEV, okay? So a plug-in hybrid, a PHEV, runs on both fuel and electricity, and as you can kind of get from the name, you can plug it in and charge it up, okay? We have hybrids, okay, so maybe you drive a hybrid. I was actually in a taxi not so long ago. It was a hybrid vehicle, and basically with hybrids what you have is you have to put fuel into them, and that fuel is used to basically charge up a battery. And the kind of outcome that you get with the hybrid is that there's lower emissions overall than a standard ICE car, okay, internal combustion engine. Then we have a mild hybrid, so an MHEV. So an MHEV basically has an electric motor in it that assists the vehicle. It makes it more efficient. So sometimes there's a bit of a debate, are mild hybrids really EVs? That's actually kind of referenced within the preceding document. Anyone's guess, okay? It's not too important. Are they EVs? Are they not? It's not really going to feature in a scenario in the exam, okay? Not that I know of anyways. Now, notes here down the bottom. So this is an interesting point. Interest in electric cars is being driven largely by environmental concerns. Okay, so here I can kind of think of some potential exam scenarios. How would we measure this? How would we gauge this? So in the past, things like pestle analysis have actually been tested directly. Okay, so could we run, for example, a pestle analysis in order to determine the extent to which people are so concerned with the environment that they would make a purchase of an EV? Okay, so that's something that maybe you could get a question on. Again, it's not a full scenario, but that's a theme that I can get from this here. Okay, so 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so pages 5, 6, and 7. And just so you're aware, I have different monitors all around me. Okay, so I'm in a new studio here, and sometimes it can be a little bit crazy, right? I have one here, I have one here, I have one here. So that's why you see me kind of looking around the place. Okay, so governments, including Duxland's, they set these targets to ban ICE car sales after 2030. And it's important to note here, new ICE car sales. Okay, and this is based on a real world development. Now, you can probably tell I'm from Ireland. Okay, so in Ireland, we're part of the EU, and in the EU, we have this phase out as well. Okay, so we have this phase out of ICE car sales. Something similar is going on in the UK and in other countries around the world as well. Okay, so these bans, in this particular context, they do not prevent the use of ICE cars. So if you own one of these cars and then there's the ban, well, you're okay. Okay, it's more so covering new ICE car sales. It also does not apply to second-hand car sales. Now, within the exam, we could potentially see a scenario where maybe there's some lobbying action in order to change this. So, what if we have, for example, a very large ICE vehicle manufacturer and they say, no way, okay, we don't like this at all. We're going to push for, let's say, 2035 or 2040. And this is something that goes on in the real world, okay? So, quite recently, we had the CEO of BMW come out and say the EU's similar ban is a terrible idea, okay? So, we could maybe have a question around the strategic implications of that for us, accumulator. Okay, so what happens if there's a change where this goes to 2035? That could be quite a good question. If I was the examiner, that's the kind of theme that I would push on because it's based on real world developments. Of course, these bans on ICE car sales are worrying for entrenched ICE car manufacturers. Okay, so EVs raise the following concerns, and this is really important because this is what is blocking the adoption of EVs. Okay, so we're kind of familiar with ICE cars, right? So we probably drive them. Maybe some of you have EVs, and there are some blocks to purchasing EVs. And actually, myself, right? If just kind of drawing on my own personal situation, there's some blocks that would prevent me from purchasing an EV, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And some of them that we're noting here are concerns that I would have. So the first is that they're more expensive than ICE cars. And within the pre-scene, we actually see the price differential between the two is coming down. Okay, so the price difference between the two is coming down, but it is important to note that they're more expensive than ICE cars. Okay, so there's a premium on them. There's range issues. So range is how far you can go. Okay, so how far you can go before you have to charge the vehicle. And it's noted within the pre-scene that most electric vehicles can do a commute fairly easily, but there's concerns about longer distances. Okay, and that relates to the next one, which is public charger availability. So not everyone is able to install a charger in their home. So these high speed chargers, I'm sure some of you have them, you can get them installed in your house. Not everyone can do that. So if you live in an apartment, like say for example with me, I live in an apartment in the city centre, you can't just install them into your wall. So you have to use public chargers. And there's concerns, okay? So if I drive to, let's say where I'm from in Ireland, there's probably not going to be any electric chargers, okay? So that's a concern. And when you're going through these, think about how could Accumulator lobby the government, or how could they bring different stakeholder groups together in order to resolve some of these, okay? And that is a kind of a theme that runs throughout the pre-scene document. As well, the resale value, because batteries degrade, okay? And that's something that we'll touch on towards the end of the pre-scene document. So pages 8 and 9, again, we're going into more detail on the industry, and then on page 9, we have some more information about the business itself. So we just touched on a summary at the beginning. Here we're going to get some proper information about the business. So sales of EVs, despite all the concerns, they have increased rapidly with 17 million EVs being sold in 2024. So the reason why I've included this is because when we look at the financial analysis, it's important to think about why revenues have increased so rapidly. If they have, okay, spoiler alert, they have, okay. We can obviously look at it and we can say, okay, well, the company has done very well in terms of marketing. Possibly they have, maybe an effective operation, but also there could be industry factors as well, okay? And we will get a sense for that when we look at the competitor organization. So that's why there's two companies noted when we look at the financial statements within these pre-scene documents, is to give you some context, okay? And this is giving us additional context. We're saying here that this is a kind of a booming industry, okay? So market share for EVs varies between different countries, ranging from 12 to 85%, okay? And those blocks to EV adoption are likely playing a role there on those percentages. So if you live in a country where it's, proportionally very expensive to purchase an EV, you're probably not going to see really high adoption, okay? So it's as simple as that. Now, it is hoped that demand will be stimulated through reductions in production costs, okay? So something to bear in mind as we kind of look at the different scenarios, okay? Costs are important for these businesses. And we also have some information about the share of the EV market by revenue. Now, the pre-seen document itself, it lists off a load of different companies, but we're just going to look at the top three here. So we have Adam, which is 16.7%, Dilson, 15.9%. Where did they get the names from, right? I don't know where they get them from. Cumulator is 15.4%. So we're a big business here, okay? We're quite a significant player in the EV market. Now, why have I included this? Why is this important? Well, first of all, we get the sense for the business being a fairly sizable business, okay? So that's important to be aware of. But also, if you think about it, you could have a scenario where potentially, now it's very rare, it's only happened once from memory, where potentially one of these companies, let's say Adam, looks to purchase Cumulator. Now that would give Adam a very significant market share. So one of the potential defenses to that would be to maybe communicate with the competition authorities within Duxland, okay? Because maybe you could have a monopoly within Duxland or something like that, okay? So that's how you can draw upon information within the pre-scene and kind of speculate about potential scenarios, just based on a small bit of information. Of course, that type of scenario has not come up loads. Like I said, I think it came up once. Okay, so the likelihood of it coming up, I'm not certain. Okay, so pages 9 and 10, we get more information about the business. So Accumulator produces 4 BEV models. So they're a little bit like Tesla Motors. They just produce those BEVs. So we have the Tiny, which is a small car. Okay, so it's kind of a small urban commuting car. We have the Trap. Okay, so the Trap sits or seats 5 people. The Tiny just seats 2. The Trap is slightly larger. It has a higher range than the Tiny. The Twist X is like a step above that. Okay, so it has a higher range than the Trap, and then the Scorch has the highest range. This is kind of the sports car in the portfolio. Now, what I would suggest here is, yes, we have 4 BEV models. Now, why should we care about this, or what could happen here? Well, what could happen is within the exam, you could have a situation where perhaps we divest of one of these. Okay, so we'll find out later on in the pre-scene that there's basically a factory associated with each of these. So you could see a situation where possibly we look to sell one of these brands. Okay, so buying and selling different car brands, it happens. Okay, so that could be maybe a scenario. You could see a situation where you have questions around the challenges in placing the relevant activities with the brand into a self-contained entity for sale. That has come up before in the exams. You could have a situation where we create a new brand and therefore we have a new overseas operation, which allows us to test things like political risk, interest rate risk, dealing with stakeholders, raising overseas finance, all those types of things that have come up before in the past. So each model can be purchased with a base, Lux or Grand Lux trim. So the base, as you would expect, is kind of the cheapest, so fabric seats, thin carpets. The Lux is a step above. It has some additional features as well. It has satellite navigation. And then the Grand Lux is the premium trim. Okay, so this has thick carpets and a leather seats. Okay, so different models, different trims. Okay. So reputation here is important because reputation is something that we need to manage at a strategic level. Reputation risk has sort of been tested in the past. So it has a reputation for sound build quality and innovation, and that's backed up by a warranty. Okay, so important really here to be aware of the fact that the company has a good reputation for build quality. So we could see potentially a scenario where maybe there's a recall. How would that affect the business in terms of its reputation? How do we protect the company's share price? That has come up before. How do we protect the company's capitals as per its integrated report? That hasn't been tested directly before like that, but I have tested it before in my mocks. I think that would be a question that CIMA would like to test because it's on the, I suppose it's on the trend of sustainability, which this pre-scene is all about, and we'll get that as we go through it. Okay, so what about this warranty? So it guarantees a car for 8 years or 160,000 kilometers. Now it notes within the pre-scene that this warranty applies to the battery as well. So if the battery degrades by 20% or more within those ranges, then you'll get a replacement. Okay. So page 11. So we have some additional information about the business here. There are 6 accumulator factories, okay? So this is quite interesting. We have 2 in Duxland, which is quite straightforward, and then we have 4 outside of Duxland. Okay, so what we would expect, just reading this, is that when we go into the company statement of financial position, we should see some currency reserve, okay? So we have overseas entities. That means that we're exposed to translation risk, okay, which is within the scope of the SCS syllabus. So we have translation risk. Why is translation risk important? You may be thinking to yourself, well, translation risk is It's like an accounting risk, isn't it? I mean, you might be thinking, I did that back in the MCS. Well, translation risk is a part of the overall umbrella of currency risk, and basically it arises when you have overseas entities that you translate into the group entities reporting currency. And the impact that it has is that it's contained within the statement of financial position in the equity section. So if it increases or decreases, it can affect equity, which then has an effect on our gearing ratio. And some businesses have what's known as debt covenants. Okay, so they basically agree to a set of rules when they take on debt. And sometimes those covenants can state specifically you cannot raise above a gearing ratio of, let's say, 40% or 50%. And if you have this constant translation risk affecting the value of equity, therefore changing your gearing ratio, that can be a problem. Sometimes you have to hedge that risk as a result. Now, there could be an additional factory, there could be an additional operation, as I always say. Just because they have four doesn't mean they couldn't have five within the exam. That could happen, okay? It notes here as well, each vehicle requires a lithium battery. So if you have done the pre-scene or the exams related to the pre-scene for rhodamine, you'll know all about lithium. So maybe some of you are resitting, you're familiar with rhodamine. It was a previous pre-scene that was all about lithium mining. Okay, so you're maybe an expert in lithium mining, which will actually be quite useful here. So now we're looking at kind of further down the line what happens with that lithium. So it's used for these batteries which are placed in EVs. Okay, now Accumulator actually manufactures its own batteries, which is not super uncommon in the real world EV industry. Now, lithium mining and transport are a significant source of emissions when manufacturing EVs. And again, this theme of sustainability runs so strong in this pre-scene, okay? And if you go on, CIMA ASCPA's LinkedIn, you see they talk about sustainability non-stop. So this is a big theme for the Institute, and we'll see more of this as we go through the pre-scene. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why have you included that, Hugh? Why is that important? Well, if you think about it, you could have a scenario around this. So how do we manage this? Okay, how do we deal with this? Well, we could possibly, source lithium closer to us or closer to the factories. That might cut down on the transportation. We could do something like constructing a refinery. So lithium can be mined through brine mining, which is sort of water-based, or it can be mined from rock, which is called spodumene, okay? And basically you can refine it down into a more concentrated form, and then that could be shipped to the factories, which would be, I suppose, better from an emissions perspective. And actually, the company Tesla Motors, they have a refinery that does this. Okay, so that could be an exam scenario, the establishment of an overseas refinery right beside one of the mines. Okay, and that opens up questions again, political risk, currency risk, raising overseas finance, just raising finance in general. Okay, so those types of scenarios could pop up in your exam. So it's sold through a worldwide network of 4,600 dealerships, and they are independent businesses. Now, interestingly enough, in the real world, there are some alternative avenues to sell EVs. So BYD, for example, there's a company in China where you can just literally go on a website and buy one of these cars. Okay, I think it's called EV Direct or something like that. That's the English translation. There are alternative ways in which we can sell these vehicles. Okay, that's quite traditional, having a worldwide network of dealerships. But in terms of exam scenarios, I'm not sure if that would really pop up, but I could be wrong on that. Okay, now page 12 is so important. Okay, this is so important. I always say this, but really this is important. If there's two pages that you need to look at in the pre-scene documents, it's this page and the risk report. Okay, and if you've ever sat the SCS exam before, you'll know that these pages are important. Okay, and why? Why are they important? Well, they contain, in this case, this page contains the mission, the vision, and the values. Okay, and this is a frequently tested topic: mission, vision, and values. And it's a very common question to ask. Evaluate this strategy in terms of its consistency with either the mission, the vision, or the values, or all three, or two of them. Okay, so quite recently, all three were examined, and that type of question kind of requires you to know them in advance. Now, the good news is, in all of those cases where this has been examined, you were given the mission, the vision, and the values within the reference materials. Because this is not an exam where we're testing retention. Remember, this is a high level exam, right? So like this is like just before you're about to qualify as a management accountant, right? So this is more about internalizing them rather than remembering every single word. So generally speaking, you tend to find them within the reference materials, but that's not guaranteed. But of course, you do have a digital copy of the pre-scene inside your exam software. So you could access that and check out the mission, the vision, the values if, for example, you wanted to, you forgot them or whatever. Okay, so if you get a question like that, evaluate this strategy, evaluate this decision, this proposal, this action, in terms of its consistency with the mission, the vision, the values. What I suggest you do is try to break the mission up, if you can, and then look at the various different components in terms of their consistency with that strategy, okay? That's my recommendation. So let's get stuck into what these actually are, okay? So the mission statement in this case, Accumulator's mission is to make the world a better place by providing desirable and sustainable motor vehicles. Now, this is quite specific when you think about it, right? So it's talking specifically about motor vehicles. So what happens if we have a strategy where we look to purchase charging infrastructure? Maybe we look to set up our own charging network. Now, I think that could be an exam scenario. So if we do that, I mean, is that in alignment with this mission statement? Well, again, break it up into smaller pieces. So the first piece we could look at is, providing desirable motor vehicles. Not really, okay, so it's not 100% consistent with that. What about sustainable motor vehicles? Well, I suppose it assists with that, okay, so if we have a better charging network, as we saw with those blocks to EV adoption, well, it should help to kind of address those blocks, and then, that creates this enhanced adoption of EVs. Maybe that helps with the sustainability of motor vehicles. We get more revenues as a result of increased sales, then we can invest in improving our batteries and so on and so forth. So these are the things you should be thinking about when we're looking at those questions around consistency with the mission, the vision, the values. Now, the reason why I keep on talking about it is because it's been tested a good few times, okay? So the mission, next, the vision. So Accumulator's vision is to be the leading manufacturer of sustainable motor vehicles. It's almost like a carbon copy, right? And it's so specific. Sometimes you see vision statements and they're really pie in the sky. I mean, they're really out there. I mean, like Google has a really far out one, and some other organizations have some really broad vision statements. In this case, this one is quite specific, okay? Now, let's look at the values. So constantly innovating, you'd expect this for a business like Accumulator, okay? It's an EV manufacturer. It's in a dynamic industry, okay? So that's something that you would expect. The next one, so committed to enhancing sustainability, okay? So again, this theme of sustainability running through the pre-scene, super important for this business. Offering the highest quality in its products. So we kind of talked about the reputation that they have for quality. So you would expect this type of value to be in the business. Paying attention to the needs and desires of customers. I mean, every business should be doing that, right? I mean, that's like the basics. So in terms of questions that you could get here, I could see a potential question around adding another value, okay? Possibly due to an acquisition. So, what would be the implications of adding another value or taking away a value? Okay, so let's say, for example, we acquire another business and then there's a question, should we add a value in order to encompass this business into the overall group? Okay, what are the implications of that? So that could be a potential question I could see maybe coming up. As well, in the past, we've had questions come up around whether adherence to the values could have prevented something from occurring. So let's say, for example, we run an advertisement, okay, and that ad is misleading. You could have a question that says, well, had we adhered to our values, would that have prevented that advert from being released? Okay, that type of question has been examined before. I know it sounds a bit strange, but that has been examined before. So I could see that coming back into the exams again. That type of question, people would really struggle with this. What I would suggest, if you do get a question like that, look at each of the values and ask yourself, if we had adhered to them, would it have made a difference? So constantly innovating. Well, if you're innovating, sometimes you have to take risks. If you run an ad and maybe it's not, I suppose, it's not the most kind of normal one, maybe it's a little bit out there, you have to take risks, and possibly if we were adhering to this value, it would actually cause the negative behavior. Okay, so that would be one that I would look at, and I'd kind of go through each of the values and address it like that. Okay, so pages 12, 13, and 14. So we kind of covered off the first half of page 12, and then the rest is going on about corporate governance, really. It's about the various different directors. What I would suggest is we're not going to go through each and every bio for the directors, okay? I'm just going to go through the high-level board consumption. So in this case, we have 5 executive directors and 4 non-executive directors. Now, it's important to note here, this is often misunderstood. The UK Code of Corporate Governance 2024, you can download it for free, okay? So if you type it into your favorite search engine, you can download it. it suggests that we should have an even split between executives and non-executives. However, that does not include the chair. So in this case, in order to have even split, we would need to appoint 2 additional non-executive directors. Now, this is important to bear in mind because you could use this in a question around the appointment of a non-executive or the appointment of an executive. If we're asked about the strengths and weaknesses of appointing an executive or the strengths and weaknesses of appointing a non-executive, you could bring that point in. So if we're looking to appoint an executive, you could say, well, it furthers this imbalance. And also, something that's really important is think about why this is important. Like, why is it important to have a balance? Sometimes we talk about corporate governance and we don't really understand the rationale for the things that we're saying. I often find that when I look at the mock papers that we have on our website, and I say, does this person understand the rationale, the reason why this is suggested? Okay, so the whole role of a non-executive director is to represent shareholder interests. Okay, they're there to challenge the executives. So if you have a situation where you have, more executive directors, that decreases the voice, I suppose, if you want to call it that, of the non-executives, okay? So that's the reason. It's just to kind of greater represent shareholder interests and to reduce the risk of executive director domination on the board, okay? So the board, and that this is really interesting, they have a risk and CSR committee. We have never seen that before within the SCS pre-seen documents, okay? So I don't know if any of you have actually read through this in advance. I don't know if you were shocked to see this, okay? So this is one we haven't seen before, a risk and CSR committee. Now, we normally see within these pre-seen documents a risk committee, nomination committee, remuneration committee, and an audit committee. It's like super standard, okay? However, this is the first time we've seen risk and CSR. CSR standing for corporate social responsibility. Okay, so again, we see here the importance of sustainability for this business and also for the Institute CIMA as well, or AICPA CIMA. Okay, this theme of sustainability is going to be a big deal going forwards in this one as well, but in particular, probably in the next pre-scene in the future. Okay, so what I would suggest here with the risk and CSR committee is that you could have questions on this. Okay, if I was the examiner, what I would do is I would test what are the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, arguments for and against having the risk and CSR committees 2 separate committees. Or you could have a question around whether something happened that was negative because we had this conjoined committee. Okay, so that could be a potential question because it makes you think about the establishment of a new committee, which is something that we've had tested before, and as well just overall corporate governance. Okay, so let's say, for example, we have, I don't know, maybe we have misleading information that we published in relation to the company's sustainability performance, and then there's a question that says, evaluate whether this issue occurred because we have a conjoined risk and CSR committee. Something like that, okay? So quite interesting, risk and CSR, nomination, remuneration, and audit. Now you could have an additional committee being established here, okay? So I was recently going through some reports and looking at different companies, and what I have noticed is that sometimes businesses will have a technology and science committee, innovation committees, they will have sometimes ethics committees, sometimes they will have committees around law, legalities, and things like that. You could see here a technology committee, okay? That's something that I could see possibly coming up in your exam. The pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, should we have this committee? And of course, things that you can mention in terms of establishing a new committee, you could say, well, it raises the profile of the issue. So if it's technology, we'll have technology being discussed at the board level. There's enhanced risk oversight because this committee is going to be looking at the risks, the high level risks and the trends associated with technology. They're going to be able to challenge technology-based strategies. But of course, it slows down decision making. There could be overlap with other committees. And as well, you could have a situation where possibly we need to appoint more non-executive directors because the existing capacity of non-executive directors is, it's too much, okay? So the chief internal auditor reports to the convener of the audit committee. So why is that important? Why does that matter? You'll see this written normally in all SCS pre-seen documents. What this tells us is that the company is taking a fairly robust approach to the independence of the internal auditors, okay? So and if you were to have, for example, the internal audit team report into the CFO, that could create familiarity risk, intimidation risk. and they would be less likely to investigate the CFO's actions. So let's say, for example, the CFO is engaging in fraud in the business. Well, if I'm an internal auditor, I'm going to be a little bit nervous about investigating them, okay? Possibly I could lose my job, okay, if I'm making an investigation and possibly I make some statements that I can't back up. Well, that could cost me my job. So instead, what happens is that you have the internal audit team reporting into the audit committee, okay? Now, something just to point out, again, I didn't really touch on the bios of all the various different directors, but one that I did find interesting here, I'm going to butcher this person's name, okay? So forgive me if any of you are, it looks Greek or Cypriot, Stamatios, okay? So that's my interpretation of this name. I probably got it really wrong, okay? But interestingly enough, this independent non-executive director, it states that they were in politics in Duxland and they served on several parliamentary committees. It says here that these focused on issues relating to sustainability. So we know that within Duxland, sustainability is important. We can take from this that they may have new sustainability laws, regulations, rules that could be introduced in your exam. So for example, you could have an exam scenario where possibly the introduction of a rule or a law around the responsibility of EV manufacturers to recycle the batteries that are within the EVs that they produce. Something like that. That has happened in China actually a few years ago, where the Chinese government basically said, okay, if you're an EV manufacturer, it's your responsibility to recycle or to dispose of the batteries that are within your vehicles. Okay, so page 15. This one is a super important one. You're probably sick of me saying everything's important, but honestly, this one is super duper important. This is the principal risk report. Now, if you've ever done a course with me before at the strategic level, you've probably heard me talk about the risk register and the principal risk report. So they're actually two different things. People get them confused, okay? So just before we go into detail on this, the principal risk report is the one that you see here. This risk report is an externally focused risk report. It is given to investors, the public, stakeholders, okay? So this contains the high level risks that the business is facing. These are material risks. These are the big risks. And as well, it has the mitigation strategies for them. Now, a risk register is for internal consumption. It's way more detailed. Some of you may work in risk management. Some of you may actually work with a risk register. I used to when I worked in Treasury. And basically, it's a spreadsheet, okay? It's like a grid that contains all of the various different risks, and it contains the risk owner normally, the date of identification, the score that the risk has, the probability of occurrence, the materiality of the risk, the follow-up actions, okay? So it's way more detailed than this. This is a little bit different. This principal risk report is more so about the big risks, okay? Now, the reason why I've spent time on that is because you could have a question around whether a risk should have been on this report, and possibly around maybe removing a risk from this report or something like that. Okay, so the first risk is the risk of the threat of competition. Okay, so the board pays close attention to product development. Okay, I suppose that is a mitigation strategy for this risk. They're constantly innovating to ensure products remain attractive, and that links in quite well with their core values. Okay, customer preferences changing. Okay, so they work closely with regulators and charging infrastructure providers. So you get to see here the important stakeholders in the business. Okay, the charging infrastructure providers, they're an important stakeholder. They're addressing those concerns that we talked about. Okay, so if we have a wide, charging network, that's going to calm someone like me down so that I would buy an EV. Okay, I can drive home to my hometown and I'll be able to charge my car up. Okay, so this is a great example of how working with stakeholders, this industry, can benefit the whole industry. Okay, so working closely with regulators, something we often see within these preceding documents. Reinforcing the message that BEV is the most sustainable technology for cars. Okay. The next one. So changes in government policies. So the government plays a massive, massive, massive role in this industry. If you think about a country like China, again, I'm just back from there, so that's what's on my mind. They have played a huge role in the EV industry domestically. So they have directly funded companies like BYD. They've given them billions over the last, 4 or 5 years directly. They also have a ginormous charging infrastructure that they have funded, and they also assist with securing lithium supply. That has been a big priority for the Chinese government. So you can see in that case, the government has played a massive role, but also in the United States, the EU, the UK, they have also intervened in order to encourage EV adoption. So they work closely as a mitigation strategy with the government agencies to remain informed. So that's a form, I suppose, of risk management. So they're trying to predict, okay, could we have this surprise legislation that forces us to be responsible for these batteries, something like that. Making government decision makers aware of the impact of their proposals. So possibly, for example, they made them aware of the impact of phasing out the ICE cars by 2030. Okay, so that could have been something that accumulator assisted with. Okay, so economic factors impacting demand is another one. So economic factors, of course, is important because we have currency risk, interest rate risk, economic risk, all being tested within the SCS syllabus. And if you're on my course, you'll know there's videos, there's textbook extracts on those topics. We spend a lot of time on them. And how do they deal with this? They pay close attention to movements in relevant economic variables. Okay, you would expect that. Okay, that's like kind of the basics, right? The next one, they manage costs carefully. Now, that's an important one. Okay, so they manage costs carefully and focus on the benefits of driving its cars. So recently, CIMA have been testing this kind of strange question where they ask, is this strategy indicative of a focus strategy, a differentiation strategy, or like a cost leader strategy? Okay, so if, for example, you were to have maybe, I don't know, let's say, for example, they've come up with a new production methodology that reduces cost, you may get a question that says, does this mean now that we're pursuing a cost leadership strategy? So that's a way of, I suppose, applying those theories into more of a practical scenario, okay? Because those types of theories, they're quite theoretical, I mean, in nature. And I suppose CIMA is trying to bring those into the cases a little bit more, okay? So you could get questions on things like the emergence strategy, logical incrementalism, that kind of thing. Okay, so the next one, so supply chain interruptions. So supply chain interruptions here, that could be something like a semiconductor or lithium. Now, lithium is probably the main thing that this business has to worry about. So maintaining close relationships with suppliers and treating them well, and maintaining inventories of critical materials and components. So what I could see happening, I think a potential scenario, again, I'm not 100% certain, but a potential scenario could be a supply chain interruption issue, okay? Possibly with lithium, something like, now remember, lithium is a commodity, so its price can fluctuate based on supply and demand. Possibly we have an issue with sourcing lithium, okay? And what we have to do, let's say in this theoretical case, is come up with a long-term agreement with a lithium mine. And then you could be examined on lots of different things, okay? So evaluate the risks associated with this agreement, evaluate the currency risks associated with this agreement. If it's like a 5 to 10 year agreement and there's a price range, that's what happens in the real world, okay? So companies like Tesla Motors, they enter into these long-term arrangements with lithium mines as well. I mean, another way to deal with these types of issues is just to buy a mine. And some companies even do that. They buy a portion of the mine, or they might just buy the whole thing, okay? The next one here, so exposure to currency movements. Now, currency risk has to be one of the most dreaded topics in the SCS. And to be honest with you, at the SCS level, currency risk is not too bad. Okay, it is difficult, don't get me wrong, but it's not too bad. It's not as bad as the F3 OT exams. Has anyone sat those exams recently and done the currency risk questions? They are pretty brutal, right? It's been a long time since I've done that. I think like 9 or 10 years. But if someone wants to put into the chat box their experiences of doing those questions, don't worry too much, because currency risk is a little bit more straightforward at the SCS level. So how do they resolve this? How do they mitigate this? They have a treasury department. Now, in the past, there actually was a question around having an executive that actually had explicit responsibility for treasury. Quite a strange question in that case. So the treasury department, understanding treasury, is actually a part of the syllabus. It's quite a niche, small part, but a part nonetheless. And also the board pays close attention to the department's recommendations. But again, you would hope so, okay? Now, in the past, I have examined whether it's poor corporate governance to not look after currency risk. So that's actually intersecting two topics from two different core activities, core activity E and core activity B, okay? So here we could have a potential interaction between the two as well, okay? So pages 16 and 17, we have some financial information, okay? So we have the year-on-year comparisons for accumulator, okay? So here we have revenue growth 20.1%. Now, wow, that's a big increase, right? I mean, that's a really, really good increase. If I had that in my own business, I'd be absolutely delighted, okay? So 20.1 is good, but we don't know why. as I always say with these preceding documents, there's a lot left out. There's a lot of blank space here, right? We don't really know why. Now, we know to a certain extent that the industry is growing, okay? And if we look at the comparative business, well, we can, I suppose, investigate that assumption a little bit more if we see similar growth, okay? So increases in operating profit 86.7%. That's a massive increase. And then the net profit after tax 158.3%. So a very, very, very substantial increase there. So shareholders likely to be happy with that. But again, we don't know. Okay, so what if they had expectations of this actually being higher? So that's why I always say with the SCS, you can't just come to a quick conclusion and come to a basic conclusion. CIMA are looking for you to apply what they call critical thinking skills, which basically means making a judgment, okay, making an informed judgment. So in this case, you could say, wow, the business has done really well, 158.3% increase in net profit after tax. And of course, it is good. I mean, no one's turning that down. But what if the expectation was that they would increase it by 200%? Okay, so we don't have that context here. So always just kind of critically think about things when you're going through the SCS. That's what CIMA wants you to do. So we have key ratios. You probably know if you've ever looked at my courses or maybe you've studied with me before, you'll see me sometimes on the FLP as well. I always say with the SCS, the ratios, they're not too important, okay? You only need to have a few of them. You don't need to have a big, massive array. Some tuition providers, they have like these ginormous like set of ratios. You only need to know a few, okay? So I've calculated them for you. So the tangible assets to the total assets, okay? So why have I included this? It's 68.4%, by the way. Well, I've included this because within the scope of the syllabus, we have arranging long-term finance, okay? And if you're looking to gain debt, the provider of that debt is going to be looking for collateral. And the collateral that they're going to be looking for is more often than not a tangible asset, okay? Because an intangible asset is hard to value and it's hard to sell more often than not, okay? So having a strong base of tangible assets is a good thing in this particular instance if we're looking to raise debt, okay? So gearing, in this case, debt divided by debt plus equity. Now, within the exam, I always say, because some people like to measure it, debt divided by equity, always tell the marker using those brackets and the D's and the E's which one you're using, okay? So if you're using debt divided by equity, just put D/E, okay? So 41.1%. Now, again, we don't know if this is the industry standard. So we could look at this and say, well, that's quite high. But this needs additional context for us to really make that observation. Okay, so within, for example, the car rental industry, you have gearing ratios in the hundreds of percentages, and it's totally normal. So you might look at that and go, wow, that's crazy. But in that particular instance, that industry has those high gearing ratios. So we always need context. We have to be really careful. It's really basic just to say 41.1, that's high. Okay, we need to get some additional information in order to make that assumption. Now, something to bear in mind in the past that has come up before is dealing with debt covenants related to gearing ratios. So in the past, there was a set percentage, I think it was 50 or something like that, and the business couldn't cross over that 50 as a result of debt covenants. And you were asked, how do we overcome this? How do we deal with this? Okay. And if you own my book or if you own a course of mine, you will know the answer to that question. Okay. Effective interest rate is 8%. Okay. Again, we don't have much context behind that. Is that high? Is that low? In the real world, I suppose that is quite high. But we need to look at the comparative company to make a better judgment on that. The dividend payout ratio is 12.9%, which is quite small. And what I always say in terms of dividends is that this may change within the exam. Okay, so bear that in mind. You may have a zero dividend policy proposed, and you may have a question that says, evaluate the implications of changing our dividend policy. Okay, so that could be a potential question. You could have questions around a share repurchase. You could have questions around a scrip dividend. You could have a question around retaining the dividend finance to fund something. Now, in this particular instance, that last one is less likely because the dividend in proportion to profits is quite small. Okay, now this is really interesting here. We have a extract from a sustainability report on page 18. Okay, this is the first time we've ever seen this, and this is something that I think is going to become a part of the SCS documents going forward. So if you're someone who has turned up to this and you're saying, okay, I just want to test this out and see what this SCS is all about, and you're actually going to sit it in the next two windows, I reckon this will be a fixture within the preceding documents going forward. Okay, certainly at the SCS level. So within this sustainability report, it notes that within the category of strategy as it relates to sustainability. We focus on affected communities, so communities that are affected by our products and our manufacturing process. And as well, we ensure the customers are happy to own and use our products. Now that's common sense, okay? There's not really too much we can take out of that. Okay, now risk management, this is interesting. So risk management here shows us the interaction between sustainability and risk. Okay, so remember we saw with the committees, we saw that it's CSR and risk, okay? So sustainability creates risks. And that's one of the reasons why companies are so concerned about it. Obviously, there's a certain amount of branding, there's public relations. Okay, look at us, you know, we're a sustainable business, we can promote this, this is fantastic. Of course, that plays a role. However, sustainability and sustainability trends create risks for a business. They create new laws, they create changes in social standards, they create new technologies, okay? So it all comes under risk effectively, okay? So risk management in this case, how do we deal with risk? Well, we work closely with governments. That's kind of mentioned before within the risk report. And we design more sustainable batteries. Why? Because it is the case, and it's noted here, that manufacturing EV cars produces more emissions than ICE cars. Now, that's an interesting development, and that says to me that we may have themes or questions or scenarios around greenwashing, okay? So the whole concept of overstating our sustainability performance. Okay, I could see potential questions around that. It came up before, I believe, for the SCS hot air. Okay, so I don't think any of you would have sat that one. It was a few years ago. Maybe you have. There was a question around the measures that were used, and they were insufficient basically for measuring sustainability performance, and we had to comment on them. And there was this sort of theme of greenwashing, that the measures were actually greenwashing the performance of the business. Now, if we look a little bit closer, we have these metrics, okay? So we have the consumption of energy and emissions being tracked, and we also have production waste. And we have this extract here, which shows us 3 different metrics. Now, interestingly enough, we don't have the 2025 figures, so I think there could be an exam scenario where possibly you have the release of new sustainability information, and then there's a trigger. Maybe there's a share price decrease. Maybe there's a negative comment from a pressure group that says, hey, you guys are greenwashing. You guys are overstating your sustainability performance. And why do I say that? Well, let's look at the measures, okay? So let's critically think about the measures here. So some of you may have looked at these and said, okay, well, electricity consumption up 52.4%. Well, that's not good. CO2e emissions. So CO2e just here, whereas CO2 equivalents, okay? So that's like all greenhouse gases combined, minus 11, okay? So that's a reduction. That's supposedly a good thing. Manufacturing waste intensity, minus 5.6%. But let's look at the measures. Okay, so the first one, total electricity consumption. That's just an absolute measure. So it's actually not that useful when you think about it, because if we just increase production, that's going to increase. I mean, unless there's like a dramatic change in the nature of the business. So that doesn't really tell us much. They just use more electricity. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. The next one is the intensity of CO2e emissions. It's tons divided by millions of dollars of revenue in D dollar terms. Now, if you think about it, we could have a situation where we increase revenues, and that could be done through things not necessarily related to production. So possibly we could be selling in new countries where we're able to charge higher prices. So BYD do that in Europe. Could be the case that we're just charging higher prices across the board. That could have been one of the drivers of revenue. So what I would suggest here is that actually it would be more accurate to use the number of units produced. Okay, that might be a little bit better because, you know, revenue, I mean, it could be the case that we produce something and we didn't sell it. Okay, so how does that kind of factor into this measure here? Okay, and the next one is the same. Okay, so it's tons divided by millions of dollar of revenue. So those are things just to think about. Now, you may have a situation where you're given a whole new set of measures, a whole set of graphs or something like that. I mean, that has happened in that question in hot air. You were given a graph, you were given some measures, and basically what the question was asking you to do is, you know, critically evaluate this and say, why is this not so good in terms of tracking and measuring sustainability performance? You know, good measures of sustainability performance have comparisons. They have typically benchmarks against standards. They're normally consistent. They're normally proportional. Okay, they're relevant for the business. So one of the big things in terms of greenwashing that's a big no-no is having a measure that we disclose for a few years and then it gets negative and then we drop it. Okay, and we say right, we're not gonna track that anymore because it's not so good. That can happen. Okay, so these are the things we need to bear in mind. That theme of sustainability is so strong. I had to spend a little bit more time on it than perhaps I should have. Okay, so pages 19 and 20. What are these looking at? These are looking at Adam. Okay, so again, another highly creative and obscure name, but I don't know, who cares, right? So year on year comparison, revenue growth 14.8%. So it's a massive increase again. This shows us here, now we have some comfort around our assumptions that the industry is doing quite well because we have these two businesses doing quite well. Operating profit 64.5% up and 140% on the net profit after tax. Now, again, we're not 100% certain what happened, but the strong sales, obviously a component. The operating profit, there's lots of things that could be mixed up in that. And the net profit after tax, again, lots of things mixed up in that. Okay. Key ratios, so very similar here, which shows us that accumulators' key ratios are somewhat in line with the industry. Okay. This would be really useful here if, for example, one of them was very different. That would show an outlier. That would show that possibly something happened throughout the year or the period, okay? So the tangible assets to total assets is very similar. Gearing, 42.9%, very similar. Effective interest rate is the same, 8, and the dividend payout ratio is 12.5. Now, that suggests to me that if you were talking about things like the clientele effect with dividends, okay, that possibly if we were to change our dividend policy, well, the shareholders that like the dividend policy that we have at the moment, they could go to this business, which basically has our old dividend policy. Okay, so you can actually explicitly mention that in your answer if you have a question around changing dividend policy and you want to bring in the points around the clientele effect. And that would show expert application, okay, of the preceding document. And that's why we go through it like this. And we don't just read off the pages and go, yeah, they did well, they had big revenues. Okay, so you actually think about it a little bit deeper, okay? So this page is, this is always a frustrating one for me, okay? Because there's not much information on it, is there? I mean, half the page is blank, right? So that's something that you can kind of see straight away. We have these all the time within the SCS documents, and basically they show the share price over time, okay? So we can see the share price kind of goes up, and then it goes down, and it kind of goes up, it goes down, it goes up. Now, it seems to be on a kind of a positive trajectory overall, but the problem here is that we don't know what's happened over the last few years. We have no idea, really, okay? We know recently that possibly it's the case with this kind of very end of year spike there, just at the very, very end. Possibly that's due to maybe positive financial results or surpassing expectations, but we don't really know. Okay, so the share price here, we've noted that the peak was at 110, and then the trough, which is kind of the bottom. Now, these are very rough, okay? It's very hard to actually tell the numbers, so don't come at me if you can maybe use a ruler or something like that to get a more accurate picture. It's around 38, okay, October 2020. Now, it's been volatile over the last 5 years. Now, we don't know exactly why, but here are some potential reasons. So the first could be varying financial results. So we may have been profitable, but we may not have surpassed expectations. Okay, so we may have set targets and we didn't meet those targets. You'll always see that in the discussions around market performance for Tesla. Did they meet their shipment goal? So even if they were profitable, there may still be a negative share price impact if they didn't meet the goals that they said that they would meet in terms of delivering units. Okay, that's very common for Tesla. And as well in terms of projects, do they have autonomous driving yet? Elon Musk says they're going to have autonomous driving by X year. They don't, and then it's a big problem, okay, for shareholders. Volatility in lithium pricing, that's another one. Okay, volatility in the commodity that we're purchasing here. Lithium has, it kind of stabilized a little bit, but a few years ago it had a very high commodity price and then it dropped. Okay, so it does kind of fluctuate. Okay, and that's going to have an effect on an EV manufacturer. Okay, super important there. Government policies. Okay, so if you look at the share price for BYD, okay, it's a ginormous car manufacturer. You probably have seen BYDs in your country, okay? So I see them all the time here in Ireland. You see Teslas a little bit more, but you see BYDs a lot as well. Now, government policies have really affected BYD, both inside China and outside China. So here in the EU, BYDs are tariffed, okay? And that had a significant effect on the company's share price. So it could be the case that maybe we had something similar, okay? And that theme of tariffs, that could come into your exam, okay? Now, I know you're probably thinking, okay, tariffs, like there's so many things that could come up around that theme. Am I going to be tested on tariffs directly? No. But the whole theme of, possibly one accumulator's vehicle is being tariffed in a certain country and how we manage that and how that's going to affect the business and what we do in response to it, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that could be tested, okay? It's kind of a dealing with stakeholders type of question, not necessarily being tested on the tariff itself or what's going on in the world at the moment, okay? The beta is 0.56, so that's quite low, okay? Basically, beta is a measure of the company's sensitivity to systematic risk. So this basically means that if the entire stock market, let's say this stock market here, the Duxland one, if it decreases by, let's say, 1%, then we should see a decrease in our share price of 0.56%, okay? So the share price is less volatile than the overall market on average. Now, within your exam, you could have questions that ask you, how would this affect the company's beta? How would an acquisition affect the company's beta? How would a divestment affect the company's beta? So that's been tested before, okay? So divestment or concentration in a certain industry. That's the past scenario that I'm referencing was for KCTP, which was back in November 2020. Okay, so here we have Happy Comic. You're probably thinking, well, what is this all about, right? I'm at the SCS level, I'm reading a comic. Basically, this extract is used to give you more information about the industry and also the product that is sold by the business. So pages 22, 23, and 24 just give us some more information about the industry. So batteries are sealed into EVs because mishandling could be dangerous. So you could see a potential scenario where, let's say there's a company or maybe a group of people that try to extract the batteries out of a vehicle of ours or maybe a competitor's or something like that, and it sets on fire. And then we have a question around internal controls that we can use to prevent this from happening, whether this is indicative of poor corporate governance, that kind of thing. Maybe it's indicative of a poor control environment. I think that is a highly testable topic based on the examiner's reports that I read for the last round. So EVs and ICE cars, they're controlled by computers called electronic control units. Now, this is an interesting thing because it notes here that most modern cars are in frequent communication with data centers. So that gives me the kind of inclination here that there could be some questions around cyber risk. Okay, so possibly there is a cyber attack on our data center. Possibly there's a cyber attack on the charging infrastructure. Possibly there's a interceptor attack on our vehicles. Okay, these are real world events. So cyber risk is a big, big, big piece of the syllabus under core activity D. Okay, so it could be a theme here. You could as well have some questions around ecosystems. I think you could maybe have a question where Accumulator or one of its competitors introduces an in-vehicle marketplace. Okay, so within the real world, you have these marketplaces where you can purchase apps for your car, you can purchase functions for your car. So if you own a Tesla, you'll know you can go in and you can buy like speed boosts. I mean, it's like a video game, it's ridiculous, but you can buy, self-driving features and things like that. So we could see that happening as well, which would maybe open up questions around ecosystems. Okay, so I could see that maybe happening within the exam too. Now, it's difficult to recycle EVs because heating the batteries destroys the lithium, but you can recover some of the metals like nickel. And crushing batteries requires toxic solvents. Okay, so basically one of the recycling methods that's used in the real world is crushing batteries into this like mass, and then toxic solvents are added to that mass, and then we get this lithium extraction out of it. However, trying to dispose of these toxic solvents is an environmental concern. Okay, now the role of the recyclers of these batteries, I think that could be a potential exam scenario or the foundation for one. Okay, so possibly we have maybe the acquisition of one, maybe we're dealing with one overseas, possibly we have a problem with one. That type of scenario, it could come up, okay? Now, when I'm talking about scenarios, please bear in mind, sometimes the scenarios are really far-fetched, okay? So we can't predict all of them. Sometimes they're not based on real-world events, okay? And you'll know that if you've sat the SCS before. Now, page 25 goes into detail on charging points. So it says that many motorists are reluctant to switch to EVs, and we covered this already. These are some of the blocks, okay? So concerns over range and availability of charging points. We actually talked about me. I'm someone that would be concerned about this, okay? So some drivers, it notes here within the precinct, they want local governments to provide charging points, okay? So here we see the interaction of the government and the industry and the effect that it has. And what I would say to you is that a government is not just an influential stakeholder, as it normally is in these preceding documents and also in the real world too. It's also an interested stakeholder because they have set a commitment to phase out these ICE cars. But what happens if people aren't really buying these EVs? Okay, that creates a problem for the government. They will look, embarrassed if they have to change this deadline that they've set. So they're also an interested stakeholder in this industry, and that creates an interesting dynamic. They have a vested interest in trying to increase EV adoption, not just from a sustainability perspective. Okay, they want to do right by the country, but they've also set a target and they have to kind of live by that target, right? I mean, they could lose an election or something like that if they have to revise this target down because they failed to address the concerns that people have around EVs. Okay, so that could be a potential point that you could make around political risk or engaging with the government or an ethics based question on lobbying. Okay, so the costs are as follows. So we have a domestic charger is 1,500, and then we have a public charger being 60,000. So the whole kind of argument here is that it would just cost the government too much in these sort of local municipalities to have a public charger. Now, it is the case, and this is kind of outside of the pre-scene, in some instances, governments have to step in where it's just not economical for a private charging infrastructure provider to have that infrastructure. Okay, so in order to increase adoption, the government does have to step in every now and again. In a very rural area, for example, it's not going to be economically feasible to have that charging infrastructure. But of course, it addresses that block, that concern around EV adoption. Okay, so page 26. So here we have some information about battery degradation. So EV batteries, they degrade over time. And the effect that this has is that it decreases the range and it leads to longer charge time. So we don't like this. This is a bad thing. Now, replacement batteries can cost $20,000 or more, and that's a negative because it means that in some instances, scrappage can be more cost effective, which is actually a net negative for the environment over an ICE vehicle. Because if we're having to, scrap and purchase a new car and scrap and purchase a new car, it's not really that sustainable. Okay, the ideal world would be that this car would last us for a super long time, okay? Because scrapping a vehicle, as we kind of saw, there can be problems with that in terms of recovering the lithium and, dealing with the other parts of the vehicle as well, which isn't really mentioned too much within the pre-scene, the other parts. It kind of focuses on the battery. So manufacturers have different guarantees. We kind of touched on the guarantee that we have for our business, Accumulator. It says that most manufacturers replace a battery if the range decreases by 30% or more within 8 years. Now ours is 20%. So we're better than the average, sort of, okay? Now, what kind of scenario could you come up with here? Possibly the government trying to mandate one of these and mandate and say, okay, you have to have this particular warranty with a certain percentage. And then maybe we have a question whether we should push for this. Yes, we want this because it's going to force our competitors to have to accept more unfavorable terms or something like that. I'm not 100% certain, but it could come up, okay? The next one here at 27. I always think, and this is a clue, right? When I'm writing mock papers, and I've written mock papers for many years, I normally use these articles down the end or real world events to write them. Okay, so these articles are normally a source for the mock papers or questions. So there's 80,000 EV charging points in Duxton. They're owned and operated by 12 companies. Now, what this says to me is that you could have an acquisition type of scenario. Now, in the past, we've had questions around evaluate the suitability, acceptability, feasibility of this acquisition, the strengths and weaknesses, the strategic implications, the risks, and then you have loads of scenarios that come after around integration, governance, post-acquisition governance, the financing, share exchange, earnouts. That's not been tested before, but earnouts is one I think will be tested. Okay, so these types of themes are really easy to test once you have that kind of initial setup for an acquisition. So I think possibly we could have an acquisition, and you could have a question that says, is it more advantageous to buy one or is it better to set one up ourselves? And you could have a question as well around whether we should shut out other companies from our charging infrastructure. So for example, Tesla, they have their own charging infrastructure, and you may have seen it. Okay, so if you're living in America, you've definitely seen it. And what could happen is you could have a shutout where we don't actually allow other brands to charge their vehicles in our charging infrastructure. Now, only recently Tesla has the ability to allow other companies to charge their cars using their supercharger infrastructure. Okay, so that could be a potential scenario. That's quite a strategic one, so I think it'd be a good one to test. So to use a charging point, you have to visit a website, input card details, again, themes here of cyber risk, okay, sensitive information, download an app, scan a QR code, and then you can basically charge it. And once you take out the charger, then you're charged on your card. Okay, you have to pay. So in the real world, in the UK, actually, there was quite recently a cyber criminal gang, and what they did is they put fake QR codes around the charging points. And it's quite an interesting, quite a sophisticated hack. What they did was is when you scan that QR code, it brought you to a page and it looked exactly like the charging infrastructure providers. You would input your details and they would get those details and then they would use them and sell them and so on. So we could have a situation, I think, within the exam. It might be an interesting one where we're not the victim of a cyber attack, but it's the charging infrastructure. And we have a question possibly around the implications for us as a business, how we manage this, what effect it will have maybe on our share price, something like that, and also the extent to which we are responsible. Does this indicate that we had poor corporate governance or something like that? Okay, kind of a strange one, but you could see it. Now, charging companies have different pricing structures, so city centres tend to be lower, motorways tend to be higher. You could have a situation where we become a charging infrastructure provider, and there's a question around whether it's ethical to charge more in a rural area that needs that charging infrastructure with no competitors. So we can take advantage really of that situation. So is that ethical? I think that's a really good question to test on ethics, because typically ethics based questions will normally touch upon people's personal opinions, because CIMA want to see, can you use a framework to deal with ethical issues, or are you just going to give your personal opinion? And if you go with your personal opinion, you won't score well. If you go with the CIMA Code of Ethics and you approach it from a logical, framework based perspective, you're going to achieve good marks. Okay, so that's my recommendation for dealing with ethics based questions. Right, so everyone's still with me. I see the attendance is still super high, and I'm delighted. You can tell, right? I'm happy. I love the fact that there's so many people in this live stream. If you're watching the recording, it really is cool to see so many people, and I really appreciate it. I just want to say, for everyone who has supported my brand, I'm going to get emotional now. I really, really appreciate it. The last few weeks, I have never received so many emails in my life, and I really, really, really appreciate your attendance. And if you're watching this, I really appreciate your support, your likes, comments, everything. It makes a huge difference to me. This is my business, this is my livelihood, so I really, really do appreciate it. And thank you all so much for attending. Hopefully this was worth it. Okay, I know you're giving up your lovely evening, okay, or night in some cases. So callouts, what are my callouts? Well, the first one is sustainability, right? So sustainability is a massive feature in this pre-scene, and it's a hot topic for CIMA as well. So I think you could have questions around greenwashing, sustainability measures. You could have questions here around integrated reporting, those types of things. I mean, they're quite straightforward to test here. I think they could come into your exam fairly easily. You could have a theme of sustainability that actually has questions from other topic areas. Okay, so that could also be the case, where the scenario is sustainability based, but you have questions from other areas. So a great example of this is our sustainability report. Evaluate the arguments for and against the internal audit department, reviewing that and giving an assessment of it. Okay, so that could be a potential scenario. Cyber risk, okay, so possible interceptor attacks, direct attacks on data centers, okay, possibly as well attacks on charging infrastructure. Those could be, themes within your exam. They happen in the real world, so I mean, they could happen in your exam. Remember, the person who's writing your exam watches the news, they read articles, so they're getting their ideas from somewhere. Policy impact. So governments can materially stimulate the demand of the customers that we have in our local economy through grants and incentives. Okay, so they can, for example, give grants for charging infrastructure. This is the case in Ireland, it's the case in the UK. You get a grant, I believe it's £750. And don't quote me on that, I don't live in the UK, but I believe it's £750 towards your home charger. In Ireland, we have something similar. Okay, in some countries like the USA, there's tax credits on purchasing EVs, which has been a big driver of EV demand in the United States, and that came through the Inflation Reduction Act, okay, which was passed not so long ago by Joe Biden. So supply agreements. So again, this theme of having long-term agreements, I think this would be a brilliant topic to test, because you'd be able to test possibly the currency risk, and also maybe there's a disaster. Okay, so we need to pull out of this arrangement. How would that affect the business's reputation? How would that affect the share price? Would shareholders like this? Does it matter? Do we care what shareholders think? Okay, so that type of theme I think could be really, really good and to test. Okay, if I was the examiner, that's where I would go. Okay, divestment. So this is a theme across the whole motor industry. If you work in cars or HGVs or whatever, there's a lot of buying and selling of brands. So for example, the company Stellantis, they own a ton of different car brands. The big companies, they own loads of different brands under their umbrella, like Toyota, they own, Lexus, they have lots of different brands. So I think divestment and acquisition of different brands, I think that could be a theme here. Divestment could come into play if we're being acquired. So we're being acquired, let's say, by a large ICE vehicle manufacturer. They're trying to break into the EV market. Maybe they don't really have a strong foothold. We're being acquired. How do we defend against that? What's the role of the non-executives in this particular case, in this divestment period? What's the role of the executive directors for us? Is it ethical to implement defenses against this takeover on the premise that it's going to save the executives' jobs? Okay, so that has come up before in a ethics-based question. So software altering. So this is kind of touched on a little bit within the pre-scene. So it notes that if it were the case that people were tweaking the software within the car, they can improve the performance of the car. But of course, that creates risks, right? So if it is the case, maybe there's an article that's released within your exam, and possibly it's noting that people are able to modify the software within the vehicles that they're driving. Maybe it sets on fire. Okay, so we've driven the performance too much. Is that the responsibility of the board? Okay, so that could be a potential question around the remit of the board. Is that a strategic issue? That's a core activity A type of question, which has come up before. Charging providers, so a super important stakeholder. But as I said, one of the interesting things about charging providers is that it's uneconomical in some areas to have that charging infrastructure being provided by a private enterprise. So you may see situations where the government have to intervene. That could become a theme within the exam where maybe we try to push the government into doing that. So we try to lobby the government, is that ethical, in order to provide that charging infrastructure. If we do that, then that will hopefully increase the amount of EVs being purchased in that area. ASSB batteries. So ASSB stands for all solid state batteries. If you've read through the pre-scene, you'll note that in the happy comic area, they go into detail on batteries, and you're probably, when you're reading it, you're going like, do I really need to know this? Like, this is like OCS, like I'm knowing about all the different components and the details and everything. And the answer to that is, well, okay, that gives you an idea as to what the baseline of battery technology is at the moment. But there is a next generation technology called ASSB, which is all solid state batteries. And this is like the next generation. This is the future of battery technology. Okay, so you could see these being developed within the exam. You could see a project there, possibly they're developed. We have to raise finance. Maybe there's challenges in raising the finance and so on. Okay, so enhancing charging times and power, that's the clear benefit of these batteries, but there's also enhanced safety. Now, you probably don't know about them, but they are under development by lots of different companies. For example, BYD, they're trialing their ASSB technology, and they're probably going to be using it from 2027 onwards. Recycling. So the responsibility for recycling, I think that's quite a SCS theme. Who is responsible for this? And in the pre-scene, it's like really ambiguous, but trust me, the pre-scene is just ambiguous anyways, okay? So it may not be intentional. But I think you could have an exam scenario potentially where there is clarity on who should recycle the batteries through legislation. Okay, so that clarity comes through the legislation. Now, it notes within the pre-scene that, sodium ion or lithium ion batteries rather are the main batteries. And that's true in the real world. The overwhelming majority of batteries used in EVs are lithium based, but you can actually use sodium, which is a way more abundant it's an element, I suppose, so we'll call it an element, a way more abundant element. It's cheaper, and one of the reasons why you would use it if you're an EV manufacturer is that it allows you to diversify a little bit. So if you're having issues with supply from lithium mines, and possibly there's changes in prices, well, if we go to the more abundant sodium as our element of choice, well, that could be a way of diversifying that risk, which is kind of within the scope of the SCS, diversifying risk, managing risk, and so on. So we could see a situation where we try to research this and then there's problems. Okay, so that maybe is the case. In the real world, sodium ion batteries are normally used in cars with really small ranges, so they don't have the same capacity for range as a lithium ion battery. So economic variables. So the role of economic variables in this case is really important, but it's very complex. Okay, and that's particularly the case because we have lots of overseas entities. So you could have, for example, one economic variable. I'm just okay. I see my phone is turned off for some reason, which was monitoring the chat. You could see a situation where perhaps, let's say, I'm trying to think. Let's say, for example, we've an increase in interest rates. Okay, so that's one economic variable. Well, if you have an increase in interest rates, of course, one of the impacts of that is that you have higher finance costs. Okay, so let's say you have variable debt, you're going to have an increase in finance costs. But in this particular instance, an increase in interest rates could also have an effect on demand, because if you think about people purchasing new cars in particular, when they purchase new cars, sometimes they get loans for those cars. Sometimes they get car financing. Okay, so you pay in installments, and of course, there's an interest rate attached to that. So if we see interest rates increasing, that's going to increase the cost of those loans. And if there's an increase in the cost of debt for our customer, that's going to affect our demand. Now, of course, that could have, let's say, another role. So if you have an increase in interest rates, well, that could depreciate the currency of that country. And possibly there's an advantage to us if we're, let's say, sourcing from that country. Maybe the depreciation of that currency is a good thing for us. So you can see how it's complicated. It's not so simple. Okay, so that's the interesting thing about this industry, and very similar to Leotair, which also had a very complex set of economic variables that affected the industry. I'm just trying to pull up the stream here because I like to see on the other monitor what people's comments are. Okay, so I'm just pulling it up. Okay, I can finally see it again. This is the problem with having like too many monitors. Okay, autonomous driving, so not mentioned at all. And funnily enough, I was talking about autonomous driving in a group based on the SCS, and it seems that everyone is kind of thinking that this might be an exam theme, and I think so too. So in the real world, EV manufacturers are investing in this feature. Okay, so for example, BYD, they release this for free in their vehicles. It's called God's Eye. If you ever get a chance, go on YouTube and type it in. It's really cool. You get to see people parking their car with their hands off the steering wheel. So this type of technology is out there. It creates a competitive advantage for EV manufacturers, and it could be something that we look to develop within the exam scenario. So we possibly develop it ourselves, or maybe we purchase a business that develops this software, and then that creates questions around the difficulties in valuing a business, possibly the difficulties in managing the business. Maybe there's problems with it. Maybe it wasn't sticking to its mission and vision that's come up before, and maybe we should have known better. That type of theme. Okay, that could come up. So I have a small advert at the end, right? It's tiny, but I have to plug my own products. Okay, I have to, right? If you are looking for support for this upcoming SCS, I cannot recommend this enough. The Ultimate SCS course is the best course in the market. Okay, there I said it. Okay, it's a course that I put together for. It was actually many years ago for a specific CIMA program. So just so you're aware, you've probably seen in my LinkedIn if you know me, I assist CIMA with various different international projects. So we covered the SCS in the United States, a special program over there, and as well in China. I'm a part of various different programs outside of those two countries, but they're a little bit more confidential, okay? So the Ultimate SCS course is one of the best tools that you can get to pass this exam. I spent a lot of time on this course, okay? So this contains all the theory videos that you need to pass the exam. Highly testable topic videos. Okay, so we're covering off what we call could be tested. Okay, so CBT, you'll see within the course, we're covering off all the most highly testable topics that would come up, what they would look like, and how we would approach them if they did come up. And these are all in 4K. Okay, so it's like top level quality. Expert pre-scene analysis. So you have a studio version of this. You have industry analysis. You have potential scenario analysis. You have access to our SCS textbook through our platform. Okay, so we wrote an entire textbook, 491 pages long, on this issue. 2 assessment sets. So these are 2/3 of a mock paper. They come with feedback. That feedback is vetted by me. I have a team of 6 markers at the moment. They're the best markers in the market by a mile, and they will give you the feedback that you need. Really straightforward feedback, like not a big massive ton of feedback, but also enough that you can understand where you went right, where you went wrong. 3 mock exams written by me. These mock exams are highly relevant to the pre-scene. I don't just take like the past papers and change the name. I'm sure you've seen that somewhere. We don't do that, right? We write it all proprietary. So this comes with payment plans. There's also a question pack that comes with this, 20 questions. They're some of the toughest questions I've ever written. I'm really excited for you guys to look at them and to hear you guys complain about them. Pass assurance as well. So we have a policy there. If you score between 70 and 79, we will give you 1 free re-enrollment into the next window. Of course, we're not thinking about like failing the exam, right? And direct contact with me. So we've like a community group. It's a really good community group this time. Everyone is supportive of each other, and I absolutely love it, okay? Because that's what it's all about, is helping each other pass this exam. I've done this exam, I'm here helping you. Lots of other people that I have taught now go out and help other people, and I love to see it, right? It's like a positive thing. So now we just have Q&A. I said I would terminate the session when the questions stop coming in. Now you can see my details in the corner. Just to note, I run a massive group, a massive community group. So if you want to go on WhatsApp and text me and say, I want to be a part of that group, I'll invite you for free. Okay, so if you're interested in joining that group, please, by all means, text me on WhatsApp. Or if you're interested in the products and you want to know more about them, text me on WhatsApp. Please don't ring me, because the time differences sometimes can be a little bit tough on me. Okay, so if you're ringing me from Australia or from Malaysia, I'll probably be asleep. Okay, so look, guys, I'm here to answer your questions. I really appreciate you guys sticking through the entire thing. The attendance has not wavered at all. It actually went up during the stream, which is unheard of. So yes, tempted by the textbook. Well, you know what? If you're tempted by it, you can check out the sample for free on procountancy.com. Okay, so as I always say, check it out before you buy it. I'm an open book. Okay, pardon the pun. That way, I like to give out samples. If you follow me on LinkedIn, okay, type in Hugh Martin in LinkedIn, you'll see more about me, and I love to give you samples. I am there to be scrutinized. Okay, so sometimes I make mistakes, but I put myself out there, and I'm happy to show my products. Okay, I don't hide them away, and then suddenly you buy them, and then it's a big surprise. You're like, okay, I didn't expect that, in a bad way. Okay. Okay, so I noticed, Matt, you said really interesting that accumulators beta value is 0.56, given that most real EV companies tend to be greater than one. Tesla's minus two, or around two. Oh, it's a tilde instead of a minus. Yeah. Well, if you, Matt, if you go on to Yahoo Finance and you type in BYD, now they're listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I believe their beta is 0.3 something. Okay. So check out some other companies, because you're right in the case of Tesla. I mean, Tesla is a hot stock, okay, because of the amount of volatility that it has. And that's driven somewhat by the personality of the CEO. And we're not going to talk about politics, but it's a very volatile stock because of the things that he says and things that he does, and so it's highly tradable, and that plays a role in its volatility, and so that has played a role in its beta. But check out some other ones, Matt, because the last time I saw BYD, it was less. It was actually lower than accumulators. So worth checking that one out on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Grace, it's great to see you here, and thank you so much for joining. Susie, would it be useful to review Rhodomine? Yeah, look, if you want to, yeah, sure. I mean, it is actually to a certain extent. I mean, within the book, so we have a book that I mentioned. We have in Unit B some information about the industry and like developments in the industry. It's quite thorough because it's 21 pages, and we mention lithium within that. Okay, so that maybe could kind of plug the gap. We do say in there, and that this is something that I touched on already. That Rhodomine would be a good one to look at if you were looking at past questions, and we have a past question database that we can share with you. So if you're in the group, I'll share that with everyone again, and we can all look at it, and free. It's a free resource. Okay. Um, that would be a good one to look at, is the questions. Okay, so not necessarily the pre-scene. I mean, if you want to read through the pre-scene, by all means, if you have time, of course, sure. But it would be a good idea to look at the questions. I think really, investigate the types of questions. One of the questions that came up that caused problems for people, and just this is me kind of going off tangent, but was variant 6. Okay, so variant 6 had really like a lot of currency and economic risk based questions. And one of the questions was asking about the challenges in, I'm paraphrasing here, but like evaluating the currency risk that they face overall. And I think as an EV manufacturer, it is equally as complex, okay, because of the fact that we have different overseas entities, and the change in one economic variable could be both good and bad, as it was in the case of Rhodomine, okay? So, Savani, Hugh, are there questions with the textbook? There are indeed questions with the textbook. So there are 20 questions in the frame of 10 scenarios. And I have been writing questions for many, many, many years. Okay, so for different providers and for my own company as well. If you go on my LinkedIn, you can actually see past questions that I've written. When I'm writing the questions, and this is me being very transparent with everyone, I have a grid, okay? And the grid is to fit the writing requirements that CIMA have for their official examinations, which is that every core activity has to be tested between 15 to 25% in your exam. So the overall question ratios fit within that. They're also proprietary questions, so these are questions that we've written from scratch. We haven't just kind of copied and pasted a past exam. Of course, there are some questions that may have come up in the past, but they may have been phrased differently. But we have some questions in there that have never been examined before, and I make an effort, I'll be really honest, I make an effort to make questions challenging and to make questions the types of questions that you would get on exam day. So if some of you have sat the SCS before, sometimes you read the question and you go, what are they asking me here? And really, to address that, you need more exposure to different questions to get used to the way in which they're phrased and the way they're answered. Okay, so if you get something similar, then on exam day you're sorted. I mean, that's kind of the best outcome for me. Is like, the course has, I think overall it's like 45 plus questions. Hopefully, if something similar comes up on exam day, you'll be sorted. Okay, that's my goal. Also to note as well, if you buy the course, I have like a free plan that we're giving away as part of that. Okay, so that's another kind of freebie. Torero, Hughes textbooks, fruitful goldmine. You know what? I want to say thanks so much for that, because being honest with you, right? I saw quite recently a thread on Facebook, and someone said, "Hi, I'm looking for help with the SCS," and the entire set of comments was just Procountancy, Procountancy, and I didn't ask. I don't pay people to. I don't have the money to pay people to comment on different things, right? Sometimes it looks like maybe I'm using bots or something, right? Honestly, I'm not, and it's amazing. I never would have expected when I started my own business, uh, probably over a year now. I've been in business for myself. I never would have expected people to support my company as much as they have, and really it means a lot to me. So that's why we run free things like this, is to say big thanks to everyone. Obviously, I get a chance to plug my product. You get to see more of me, and exposure is good, of course, for my business. But it's also a way of saying thanks to everyone for their support and putting me out there, promoting me. I really appreciate it. So Matt, going to drop now, but thanks for this. You really enjoying the course so far. That's brilliant, Matt, and it was great having you on. And thanks so much for, uh, you know, as I said, using your valuable time and spending it with me, and hopefully you found it useful. So, do you know how many of the last sitting students of yours passed? Well, famous, I actually don't. I'll be honest with you, I don't, because the results are to come out next week. So I'll have an answer for you next week. Sometimes this can be a bit complicated because sometimes I have people who buy courses from me and I never hear or see from them ever again. Okay, so that creates a bit of a challenge for me in terms of pass rates. One of the more recent rounds, we had around 72, 73% of people passed. The round before that, we had higher, but then we had lower numbers. So, I want to put a proper two sittings ago results not out yet. Yeah, exactly. One of the issues that I have at the moment for pass rates, just being honest with you, is that, like I said, people sometimes buy courses from me, and even though there's like all these features or whatever, I don't hear from them again. So I don't know how to count them, because I can get the pass rate figures off CIMA. It takes a while, um, but I'm not sure. Like sometimes they don't actually use the course, so I'm still stuck on whether I should measure those. But it's around 70 to 75%. The course that you're sitting, I also run it concurrently with other courses that I do in other countries. So, for example, the last window for August, I was in China delivering this course in person, and I would count those people in those statistics as well. So there's a lot going on in those stats. But I'm going to put something together and put it up on LinkedIn when I know more about the most recent round. It's the first time, being straight up, where I've actually tracked things properly, and I've had student lists. Running this business, like, there's been huge demand, and sometimes I just don't have the time to kind of track people after they've left the kind of the process of doing the exam, and I never hear from them. It's hard to get the result back quickly. Okay, so some of them I'm still waiting to hear back from. How can we get the Q&A, please? So Q&A, as in the questions and answers, it's inside the textbook, so it's a digital, it's accessible only inside our platform. You have 20 questions, 20 answers, in the frame of 10 scenarios, 10 exam size scenarios. So that's basically like 3 mocks, 3.1 mocks or whatever. Savani, it's hard to count stats as some people use multiple providers. So this is the problem that I'm having at the moment, is that Sometimes people will use the FLP and me, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. Of course, like I'm happy for people to do both. I don't mind. You would have seen me on the FLP, especially at the OCS level. A ton of my materials are on the FLP, so people might be familiar with me and they say, all right, I want a little bit more than what I get on the FLP. The problem is that sometimes, they, as you said, they might be doing live stuff with the FLP that might not be 100% the same as me. And so that problem occurs. But like I said, between 70 and 75. Now, one time we had like a really high pass rate, but I don't like saying it because we had low numbers, right? So, um, if I have like, let's say 10 people on a course and nine of them do well, I mean, wow, 90% pass rate, but like, 10 people on the course is not massive. So sometimes we have numbers that go into, the 50, 60, 70, hopefully this round is kind of ratcheting up to around 100. Okay. So, it's a little bit more meaningful in that regard. Thanks a lot. I'm on the FLP currently, so I think that's mixed with your textbooks a good option. Yeah, look, I appreciate that, and if you're on the FLP, you're on the FLP. A lot of people are these days. We have a lot of people that are now, inside the FLP and getting the textbook. That's like something that's quite common. Simba, yeah. So look, the payment plan is really basic. We don't administrate it. It's striped. There's no interest. There's nothing. There's no catch or anything. You just take half the payment today, and then in a month, the other half comes out. Okay. So in exactly a month's time, it's on your card. Okay. So there's no big process behind it or anything like that. It's all administrated through Stripe, which is one of the biggest payment processors in the world. So it's really straightforward. If you decide to go on a payment plan, great, because it's a great way of spreading the payments out. And we have a lot of people that do that actually. They go on the payment plan. It seems to be a popular way of paying for these courses. And just remember, these are in euros. So this is a big thing that I get, right? Because I'm based in Ireland, so we use euros here, and often you'll find the courses in the CIMA universe are priced in pounds. We're priced in euros, so if you're based in the UK, or even if you're based in South Africa, or I don't know, wherever, Zimbabwe or Zambia, it is a little bit more advantageous to use euros or to translate into euros or transact in euros than it is GBP. So often you'll see courses in GBP. Ours are a little bit more cost effective if you're purchasing using your pounds or whatever currency. Okay, guys, any other questions before I head off? I did make a commitment. I said I would answer all of your questions before I go, okay? I'm curious, does anyone have any questions kind of, I don't know, about the pre-scene? I mean, look, this is going to be a tough journey the next few weeks, right? So whichever provider you're using, or maybe you're not using a provider at all, maybe you're like a self-studier, what I would say is just keep at it, right? I mean, it's really hard to keep the momentum going, but hopefully the excitement of like the pre-scene being released, the kind of the energy behind it will keep you going, okay? And that you'll use that to keep studying, keep your momentum going, okay? It is tough. Like I've studied for these exams myself. I mean, I didn't give you a big intro about myself, but like I was a prize winner in the OCS. I passed all these exams. I've done them myself. They're not easy. It's hard to balance it with work and all the responsibilities we have, like childcare, looking after people, and so on. And everyone is different, right? Lots of people have different circumstances, and some of them you would never like think that people have that they share with me. Whatever the case is for you, I mean, you have to make sure that you're committed to passing this exam. Okay, so no matter what happens, you need to be able to overcome it. Like in some cases, like for example, like in my case, right, like I had like nowhere to live at one stage. Like the landlord I was dealing with, it was like a sublet, and they kind of cancelled the sublet, so I had to like find somewhere to live. So I was like studying on couches and things like that, and like not ideal, right? And I was like self-studying. My employer wouldn't fund my studies, and all these kind of things happen in the real world, right? You just got to keep going, and if it's been negative for you, or if you don't have a supportive kind of employer like I had, passing is the best thing you can do, right? Because you can move on to something that's better, okay? And for lots of people, passing is a big difference between, the types of jobs that they can get, and being a little bit more senior in an organization, or maybe in a new organization or whatever. So just past the MCS, guys, you know what I think the MCS, I'm gonna say is the hardest of the three. I hate the MCS. Okay, so well done everyone who passed the MCS that's looking to graduate into the SCS. Well done. I think the MCS is pretty horrible, to be honest. it's a real tough one, right? Because it's detailed and it's also kind of broad. It's like the SCS and the OCS mixed together. So look, guys, I don't think there's too many questions. I'm happy enough just to terminate it and to let you guys enjoy the rest of your night. I know for some of you in South Africa in particular, we have a big, massive South African base. It's like pretty late where you are. So thank you so much. And yeah, look, even if you're in the UK, you're in Ireland, it's pretty late, right? It's a Friday. So I'll let you guys go. And look, thanks so much for your attendance. The recording will be uploaded automatically, so you'll have that and can watch it at any time. Okay. So, guys, add me on the number, text me if you're curious about any of the products that we have at procountancy.com. We have 3 products that you can buy. I'm happy to answer questions on them. The next few days are going to be really busy for me, so I might be slow to get back, but I will get back to you. Okay, so don't panic. So, guys, thank you so much for everything, and we will see you hopefully in the next live session, which is the crash course, which gets even more people on it and will be even longer and even more valuable to you, hopefully. Okay. So that pretty much wraps up everything, guys. And like I said, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you in the next stream.